Switzerland's dark secret. The myth of neutrality in W2. When you think of Switzerland during World War II, what comes to mind? Peaceful mountains, Red Cross hospitals, a sanctuary untouched by the horrors consuming Europe, a nation that stayed neutral while the world burned. That's what they taught us in school. That's what the history books said. That's what Switzerland wanted the world to believe. But what if I told you that Switzerland's neutrality was a carefully constructed lie? What if the truth was so dark, so controversial, that it took 50 years before anyone dared to speak it out loud? Welcome to Echoes of W2. I'm your host, and today we're going to expose one of the biggest cover-ups in World War II history. This is the story your history teacher never told you. This is the story Switzerland tried to bury. Let's start with what we were taught. Let me take you back to your high school history class. Chapter on World War II. The teacher pulls down a map of Europe. Germany in grey, the Axis powers spreading across the continent. The Allies in blue, fighting back. And there, right in the center of it all, sits Switzerland, a small white dot. Untouched, neutral. The teacher explains. Switzerland maintained its neutrality through both world wars. It provided humanitarian aid. It hosted peace negotiations. It was, in essence, the moral conscience of a continent gone mad. And we believed it. Why wouldn't we? Switzerland had been neutral since 1815. After Napoleon's defeat, the major European powers had guaranteed Swiss neutrality. It was international law. It was sacred. During World War I, Switzerland had maintained this neutrality successfully. They'd provided asylum to refugees. They'd facilitated prisoner exchanges. The International Committee of the Red Cross operated from Geneva, the very heart of Swiss humanitarian values. So when World War II began, in September 1939, everyone expected Switzerland to do exactly what it had done before. Stay out of it. Remain neutral. Be the one safe haven in a continent descending into barbarism. And on paper, that's exactly what happened. Switzerland never officially joined the war. No Swiss soldiers fought in the Wehrmacht or the Allied armies. The Swiss flag never flew over occupied territories. Technically, legally, officially, Switzerland was neutral. But here's what they didn't teach us in school. Neutrality doesn't just mean staying out of a war. True neutrality means treating all sides equally. It means refusing to help either side. It means maintaining genuine independence from the conflict. Switzerland did none of those things. What I'm about to tell you is based on historical documents that were sealed for decades. Records that Switzerland fought desperately to keep hidden. Evidence that only came to light in the 1990s, when a combination of pressure from Holocaust survivors, investigative journalists, and brave Swiss historians finally forced the truth into the open. So let's go back to September 1939. Back to a small Alpine nation suddenly surrounded by the greatest evil the modern world had ever seen. And let's discover what really happened in neutral Switzerland. Our story begins with what Switzerland is most famous for: its banks. Swiss banking secrecy wasn't invented during World War II, but it became codified in 1934 with the Swiss Banking Act. This law made it a criminal offense to reveal a client's identity. The punishment: prison time. Swiss banks became the most secretive financial institutions in the world. The Nazis loved this. From the very beginning of their regime, high-ranking Nazis opened secret accounts in Switzerland. They knew that if they lost the war, if the Reich fell, they'd need money hidden away where no one could trace it. Swiss banks were perfect. But the real story, the truly horrifying story, begins with something called looted gold. When the Nazis conquered a nation, they didn't just take territory. They systematically looted everything of value. Gold reserves from national banks, wedding rings torn from fingers, dental fillings pried from the mouths of concentration camp victims. All of it melted down into anonymous gold bars. And where did this gold go? Switzerland. Between 1939 and 1945, Nazi Germany transferred approximately $400 million worth of gold to Swiss banks. In today's money, that's roughly $6 billion. The Swiss National Bank accepted it. Private Swiss banks accepted it. They knew where it came from. They knew it was stolen. They accepted it anyway. Let me be specific here, because the details matter. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, conducted 280 gold transactions with the Swiss National Bank during the war. The Swiss later claimed they didn't know the gold was looted, that they couldn't tell the difference between legitimate reserves and stolen treasure. This was a lie. Documents revealed in the 1990s proved that Swiss bankers were repeatedly warned about looted gold. The Allied powers sent diplomatic notes. Refugees testified about the systematic theft. Intelligence reports detailed the Nazi looting operations. The Swiss knew. They always knew. But here's where it gets even darker. Some of that gold came from a place called Operation Reinhard. That was the Nazi codename for the systematic murder of Polish Jews. The camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. At these camps, the Nazis killed approximately 1.7 million people and confiscated everything they owned. Watches, jewelry, gold teeth, currency, all of it was shipped to the Reichsbank, melted down, turned into standardized gold bars, and then deposited in Swiss banks. The Swiss National Bank accepted gold that was quite literally stolen from murdered Holocaust victims, and they held on to it for decades. But the banking scandal goes beyond just gold. Swiss banks also held accounts for wealthy Jews who were trying to protect their assets from Nazi confiscation. These were legal accounts, opened before the war, intended as a financial lifeline for families fleeing persecution. After the war, when survivors or their descendants tried to claim these accounts, the Swiss banks denied they existed. They demanded death certificates for people who'd been murdered in concentration camps, where no records were kept. They demanded account numbers that had been destroyed when entire families were wiped out. They used their own secrecy laws as a shield against justice. Estimates suggest that Swiss banks held between $1.5 and $4.5 billion worth of unclaimed Holocaust victim assets. For 50 years, they simply kept the money. Let me tell you about one specific case, because it makes this real. Estelle Sapir was a girl in Poland when the Nazis invaded. Her family was wealthy. Before fleeing, her father deposited a fortune in Swiss banks. He gave the account information to Estelle, making her memorize the numbers. He thought the money would be safe there, that Switzerland would protect it. Her father died in the Holocaust. Her mother died in the Holocaust. Her siblings died in the Holocaust. Estelle survived. After the war, she went to Switzerland to claim the family's money. She had the account numbers. She had documentation. She had proof. The banks denied the account existed. They stonewalled her for decades. It wasn't until the 1990s, when international pressure finally forced Swiss banks to open their wartime records, that Estelle's account was acknowledged. She was 81 years old. She'd spent 50 years fighting for what was rightfully hers. And she was one of the lucky ones. Many survivors gave up. Many died before seeing justice. Many simply didn't have the resources to fight Swiss banking institutions for decades. It gets worse. Swiss banks didn't just hold Nazi gold and deny Holocaust survivor accounts. They actively helped Nazis hide their personal fortunes. When senior Nazi officials saw the war turning against Germany, they started moving their personal wealth to Switzerland. Swiss banks opened accounts for SS officers, for concentration camp commandants, for the architects of genocide. After the war, these accounts remained active. The money stayed safe. Some of these Nazi accounts remained undisclosed until the 1990s. The truth only emerged because of a lawsuit. In 1996, Holocaust survivors filed a class action lawsuit against Swiss banks in U.S. federal court. The pressure was enormous. The evidence was overwhelming. In 1998, Swiss banks finally agreed to a settlement of $1.25 billion. But even then, they admitted no wrongdoing. They claimed they were settling to close a painful chapter. They maintained they'd done nothing wrong, that they were simply following their own laws. that neutrality required them to treat Nazi gold the same as any other deposit. Neutrality. That word again. As if accepting stolen gold from mass murderers is somehow neutral behavior. But Switzerland's betrayal of Jewish victims didn't stop at banking. It extended to the very borders of the country, to the refugees desperately trying to escape Nazi persecution. This is perhaps the most painful part of Switzerland's wartime record, because when people think of Swiss neutrality, they often imagine a haven, a place where refugees could flee, where the persecuted would find safety. The reality was the opposite. Let me take you to August 1938. Austria has been annexed by Germany. German Jews are fleeing in massive numbers. They're going anywhere that will take them. Many head for Switzerland, the neutral country in the heart of Europe. The Swiss response: close the borders. On August 19, 1938, Switzerland's police chief, Heinrich Rothmund, met with German officials in Berlin. The topic of discussion: how to identify Jewish refugees at the border, so they could be turned away more efficiently. The solution they reached was the J stamp. Jude, Jew. Germany agreed to stamp the passports of all Jewish citizens with a large red letter J. This made it easy for Swiss border guards to identify and reject Jewish refugees, while still admitting non-Jewish Germans. Switzerland had literally collaborated with Nazi Germany to create a system for identifying and rejecting Jewish refugees. Let that sink in. The official policy was called Das Boot ist voll. The boat is full. Switzerland claimed it couldn't accept more refugees, that the country was too small, that resources were limited, that accepting more Jews would threaten Swiss security. But documents show this was a lie. Switzerland was selective about which refugees it accepted. Political refugees with valuable skills, often admitted. Wealthy refugees who could pay, frequently allowed in. Jewish refugees fleeing genocide, turned away. The statistics are devastating. Switzerland accepted about 20,000 Jewish refugees during the entire war, but it turned away an estimated 24,500 refugees at the border. These weren't just numbers. These were people, families, children. Many of them were sent back directly into Nazi hands. Let me tell you about some of them. The Mandowski family reached the Swiss border in August 1942. They were Austrian Jews who'd fled to France, then tried to escape to Switzerland when France became too dangerous. The Swiss border guards turned them back. The entire family was arrested by French police, deported to Auschwitz, and murdered. Or the Sonberg family, parents and 3 children, turned away at the Swiss border in 1942, captured, deported to Auschwitz, murdered. Or take the story of a Jewish boy named Ralph Weil. He was 11 years old in August 1942. His parents sent him alone to Switzerland, hoping he'd be safe. Swiss authorities caught him at the border. They sent him back to France, back to the Vichy regime, back to a country that was actively collaborating with Nazi deportations. Ralph survived by sheer luck, but thousands of children in similar situations did not. Here's the thing that makes this even worse. Switzerland knew. They knew what was happening to Jews under Nazi control. By 1942, information about the Holocaust was available. The systematic deportations were documented. The death camps were known. And yet Swiss policy didn't change. In fact, in some ways it hardened. Internal documents from the Swiss Federal Police show officials discussing how to make the borders even more restrictive, how to reduce the number of refugees being admitted, how to deal with the Jewish problem. There were exceptions. Some brave Swiss citizens helped refugees cross illegally. Some border guards looked the other way. Some police officers falsified documents to help refugees stay. But these were individual acts of courage, not national policy. The official position of the Swiss government was rejection. The official position was that Jewish refugees were a threat. The official position was to collaborate with Nazi Germany to keep them out. And here's another dark detail. The refugees who were admitted to Switzerland weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. They were placed in labor camps, forced to work, kept under strict surveillance. The Swiss called these places reception centers, but they were essentially detention facilities. Refugees were forbidden from seeking employment outside the camps. They couldn't freely move around Switzerland. Families were often separated. The conditions were harsh. Not concentration camps, certainly, but hardly the safe haven of popular imagination. Paul Grüninger was a Swiss police commander who defied these orders. In 1938 and 1939, he falsified documents to allow hundreds of Jewish refugees into Switzerland illegally. He backdated entry permits. He looked the other way when refugees crossed the border after the official closing date. For this act of humanity, he was fired, prosecuted, and convicted of official misconduct. He lost his job and his pension. He died in poverty in 1972. It wasn't until 1993, more than 20 years after his death, that Switzerland officially pardoned him and recognized him as a hero. That tells you everything you need to know about Switzerland's priorities during and after the war. So when we talk about Swiss neutrality, when we talk about Switzerland as a humanitarian nation, we need to remember this. They turned away refugees who were fleeing genocide. They collaborated with Nazi Germany to identify Jewish refugees. They sent people back to their deaths. That's not neutrality. That's complicity. But Switzerland's support for Nazi Germany went beyond banking and borders. It was economic. It was industrial. It was the kind of support that kept the Nazi war machine running. Let's talk about trade. Throughout the war, Switzerland maintained extensive trade relationships with Nazi Germany. They exported precision instruments, ball bearings, ammunition components, machine tools. These weren't civilian goods. These were materials used directly in weapons production. Swiss companies sold products to Germany, knowing they'd be used to manufacture tanks, aircraft, and artillery. And this wasn't a small-scale operation. By some estimates, Switzerland provided Germany with about $1 billion worth of goods during the war. The Swiss government authorized these sales. They facilitated the transactions. They ensured the goods reached Germany despite the Allied blockade, and they profited enormously from them. Let me give you a specific example. A Swiss company called Oerlikon produced anti-aircraft guns. During the war, they sold weapons to Nazi Germany. The same guns Switzerland claimed they needed for their own defense. They were manufacturing and selling to Hitler's regime. When the Allies protested, Switzerland claimed neutrality required them to trade with all sides equally. But here's the problem with that argument. Switzerland's trade with Germany vastly exceeded its trade with the Allies. The numbers weren't even close. Then there's the railway system. This is one of the most damning pieces of evidence against Swiss neutrality. Switzerland's railway network connected Germany to Italy. This was crucial for the Axis powers. Italy was Germany's main ally in southern Europe, but transporting troops and supplies required crossing the Alps. Switzerland sat directly in the middle. A truly neutral country would have closed its railways to military traffic, would have refused to allow any warring nation to use its territory for military purposes. Switzerland did the opposite. Throughout the war, Swiss railways transported German war materials to Italy. Ammunition, weapons, fuel, even troops on certain occasions. The Swiss charged fees for these services. They made money facilitating the Axis war effort. When Allied bombers accidentally hit Swiss territory, while targeting German positions near the border, Switzerland filed complaints, demanded compensation. But when German trains full of weapons rolled through Swiss tunnels, heading to the Italian front, that was apparently just business. The hypocrisy is stunning. Let's talk about specific Swiss companies and what they did during the war. Braun Boveri & Company, one of Switzerland's largest industrial companies. They supplied electrical equipment to Germany throughout the war, equipment used in German weapons factories. After the war, they claimed they had no choice, that Germany forced them to supply goods, but documents show they actively sought German contracts and made enormous profits from them. Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft manufactured artillery components, sold them to Germany, profited from the war. Sulzer Brothers produced diesel engines and industrial machinery, maintained business relationships with German firms throughout the war. After the war, claimed they were forced to cooperate. Yet their profit margins during the war years tell a different story. And it wasn't just large corporations. Smaller Swiss companies also participated. Watchmakers sold precision timing mechanisms used in bombs. Chemical companies sold materials used in munitions. The entire Swiss economy was, to varying degrees, integrated into the Nazi war effort. Now, to be fair, Switzerland did face genuine threats. The country was surrounded by Axis powers. Germany could have invaded at any time. Some historians argue that Switzerland's economic cooperation was a form of survival, that trading with Germany was the price of maintaining independence. But here's the problem with that argument. If cooperation was truly about survival, why did it continue even when Germany was clearly losing the war? By 1943, the tide had turned. The Allies were advancing. The defeat of Nazi Germany was increasingly inevitable. Yet Swiss companies continued doing business with Germany. Swiss banks continued accepting Nazi gold. Swiss railways continued transporting Axis materials. If this was truly about survival, you'd expect Switzerland to scale back these activities as German power waned. Instead, they continued nearly until the end. There's also the question of Swiss industry using forced labor. Several Swiss companies operated subsidiaries in Germany and occupied territories. Some of these facilities used slave labor from concentration camps. Swiss corporate executives knew about this. Some even visited these facilities. After the war, Swiss companies claimed they had no control over their German subsidiaries, that they were powerless to prevent the use of forced labor. But they certainly had no problem accepting the profits generated by that labor. The Allied powers knew what Switzerland was doing. British and American intelligence documented Swiss-German trade. They pressured Switzerland to reduce economic cooperation with Nazi Germany. Switzerland's response was always the same. Neutrality required them to trade with all sides. They'd reduce trade with Germany if they could increase trade with the Allies. But the Allied blockade made that difficult, so they had no choice but to continue trading with Germany. Convenient, wasn't it? The blockade, that was supposed to weaken Nazi Germany, somehow, became an excuse for Switzerland to support it. In 1943, the Allies finally threatened serious consequences. They warned Switzerland that if economic cooperation with Germany didn't decrease, there would be repercussions after the war. Swiss assets abroad might be frozen. Trade relationships would be severed. Switzerland would be excluded from post-war reconstruction. Only then did Switzerland begin to slowly reduce its support for Germany. Not because it was the right thing to do, not out of moral conviction, but because it was becoming economically and politically expedient. That's not neutrality. That's opportunism. Now let's talk about something rarely discussed. Switzerland's military actions during the war. Because even here, in matters of pure military neutrality, Switzerland's record is compromised. A neutral country, by definition, treats all belligerents equally. If you shoot down aircraft from one side, you shoot down aircraft from all sides. If you intern soldiers from one army, you intern soldiers from all armies. Switzerland didn't do this. During the early years of the war, Swiss air defenses shot down 11 German aircraft that violated Swiss airspace. Germany was furious. They threatened consequences. Switzerland backed down immediately. After that, violations of Swiss airspace by German aircraft went largely unpunished. German planes flew reconnaissance missions over Switzerland. They sometimes pursued Allied aircraft into Swiss airspace. The Swiss response became increasingly passive. But when Allied aircraft violated Swiss airspace, different story. Swiss fighters intercepted Allied bombers regularly. Between 1943 and 1945, Switzerland shot down multiple Allied aircraft. American bombers were the most frequent victims. When these planes made emergency landings in Switzerland after being damaged, the crews were interned. Here's where it gets interesting. The way Switzerland treated interned soldiers varied dramatically. depending on which side they fought for. Allied airmen, who were interned in Switzerland, were held in camps under strict guard. Escape attempts were punished. They remained imprisoned until the end of the war. German pilots who landed in Switzerland, many were quietly returned to Germany. Swiss authorities often claimed these pilots had escaped from custody, but evidence suggests these escapes were facilitated. Some German pilots were even given fuel before being sent back across the border. This wasn't neutrality. This was bias. American and British officials protested. They provided documentation showing the discrepancy in treatment. Switzerland denied any favoritism, claimed they were following international law equally for all parties. But the numbers don't lie. More Allied aircraft were shot down. More Allied soldiers were strictly interned. German violations of Swiss airspace went increasingly unpunished. There's also the question of intelligence sharing. Documents released decades after the war show that Switzerland shared intelligence with Germany about Allied air operations. Not frequently, not systematically, but it happened. Swiss military observers on the border sometimes passed information to German forces about Allied bombing raids. The justification was always that Switzerland needed to maintain good relations with Germany for security reasons. But sharing military intelligence with one side of a conflict isn't neutral behavior. To be completely fair, Switzerland also shared some intelligence with the Allies. Swiss intelligence did help Allied operations on certain occasions, but the relationship was never equal. Switzerland cooperated more extensively with Germany throughout most of the war. Why? The answer is simple: fear. Switzerland was surrounded by Axis territory for most of the war. The threat of German invasion was real. Switzerland's military strategy, called the Redoute, involved retreating to the Alps and fighting a defensive war if invaded. But nobody wanted to test if that strategy would actually work. So Switzerland made compromises. Small ones at first, then larger ones. Shooting down fewer German planes. Looking the other way during airspace violations. Facilitating escapes for German pilots. Trading extensively with Germany, accepting Nazi gold. Each compromise probably seemed reasonable at the time. Each one could be justified as necessary for survival. But added together, they paint a picture of a nation that was neutral in name only. So if all of this is true, if Switzerland's wartime record was so compromised, why didn't we know about it? Why did the myth of Swiss neutrality persist for 50 years? The answer is simple. Switzerland actively suppressed the truth. After World War II ended, Switzerland moved quickly to protect its reputation. Government officials worked to ensure that certain documents remained classified. Banking records were sealed. Military records were restricted. Corporate archives were closed to researchers. The Swiss government commissioned an official history of Switzerland during the war, published in the 1960s and 70s. These volumes portrayed Switzerland as a nation that successfully maintained neutrality. Despite enormous pressure, the darker aspects were minimized or omitted entirely. For decades, this was the accepted narrative. Historians who questioned it faced resistance. Archives remained closed. Sources were unavailable. Switzerland's wartime government was praised for navigating impossible circumstances with skill and integrity. But cracks began to appear in the 1980s. A new generation of Swiss historians started asking difficult questions. They demanded access to archives. They interviewed survivors. They examined corporate records. What they found contradicted the official history. They found evidence of extensive economic collaboration with Nazi Germany. They found records of refugee rejection. They found documentation of Nazi gold transactions. The Swiss establishment fought back. These historians were accused of being unpatriotic, of tarnishing Switzerland's reputation, of failing to understand the complexities of wartime decision-making. But the evidence was overwhelming, and it kept mounting. The breakthrough came in the 1990s, when Holocaust survivors filed lawsuits against Swiss banks. Suddenly, the world was paying attention. International pressure forced Switzerland to open archives that had been sealed for 50 years. In 1996, the Swiss government finally established an independent commission to investigate Switzerland's wartime record. It was called the Bergier Commission, named after its chairman, Swiss historian Jean-François Bergier. The commission worked for 5 years. They examined millions of documents. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They investigated banking, trade, refugee policy, and military actions. Their final report, published in 2002, was devastating. It confirmed everything the revisionists had been saying. Switzerland had collaborated economically with Nazi Germany. Swiss banks had accepted looted gold. Switzerland had turned away refugees who later perished in the Holocaust. Swiss companies had profited from the Nazi war effort. The report concluded, Switzerland's neutrality cannot be considered to have been an unwavering principle, consistently upheld throughout the war. That's diplomatic language, for it was a lie. The Swiss government accepted the findings. They issued official apologies. They acknowledged that wartime policies toward refugees were morally wrong. Swiss banks made financial settlements with Holocaust survivors. But even today, the full truth remains uncomfortable for many Swiss citizens. There's still resistance to acknowledging the extent of Switzerland's wartime collaboration. Textbooks have been updated, but the old myths die hard. So what do we take away from all this? What's the lesson of Switzerland's dark secret? First, that neutrality is never as simple as it appears. That claiming to stay out of a conflict while simultaneously supporting one side isn't neutral at all. That inaction in the face of evil is itself a choice. Second, that the history we're taught is often incomplete. That comfortable narratives persist because they're useful. That the full truth sometimes takes generations to emerge. And third, that we should question official histories, especially the ones that make nations look good, because the truth is usually more complicated, more troubling, and more important than the myths we're told. Switzerland wasn't neutral during World War II. It was compromised, complicit, and collaborative with Nazi Germany. Not because every Swiss citizen supported the Nazis, not because Switzerland wanted the Axis to win, but because survival, profit, and self-interest outweighed moral principle. Your history teacher didn't tell you this. The textbooks left it out. But now you know. This is Echoes of W2. If this video opened your eyes to something you never learned in school, share it. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget.